Welcome everyone to this session for Coalesce. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Andrew Tom. I am a senior data analyst at DBT Labs, but also your MC for this session. The title of this session is From Worst to First, Revamping Your DBT Project to be World-Class. And I have the pleasure of introducing our two speakers today. The first of which is Kelly Burdine. She's Director of Data Science and Analytics at Wealthy, a health tech company trying to revolutionize the caregiving experience. And fun fact, she was the first data hire at 2 different tech companies. She'll be joined by Michelle Ballen, who's worked in analytics at a range of startups and big tech companies. She's now the head of analytics at Future. She is passionate about making data a joy to work with, and fun fact, she is an OG of our DBT Slack community, having joined in April 2017, back when the number of community members in our Slack numbered less than 100. So, OG 100. Quick housekeeping before we begin. All conversation and Slack Q&A will occur in the Slack channel. It's titled incorrectly on the slide, but it's Coalesce From Worst to First. And that's Coalesce From Worst to First. If you haven't, for those of you tuning in online, if you haven't already joined our Slack channel, please join at community.getdbt.com to join our Slack community and go ahead and search for Coalesce From Worst to First. After the talk, as you drop questions in the Slack channel, our speakers will hang around for a little bit to answer questions and then respond to other questions in the Slack channel as well. And without any further ado, let's get started. Come on up.
Thank you.
All right. Hi, I'm Kelly.
I'm Michelle.
We're super glad to be here speaking in front of you, so thank you for everyone attending and for everyone watching online. Michelle and I have, like Andrew mentioned, been using DBT since 2017, and combined we've managed a total of 6 different teams throughout our careers using DBT, so we definitely love it. But what's interesting is that Michelle and I have actually never worked together. In fact, we just met each other for the first time 2 days ago in person here in New Orleans. So it might be kind of weird that you have these 2 people up here who never worked together giving a talk like this. But what's interesting is earlier this year, we both started new roles and found ourselves in similar positions where we inherited teams that were using DBT but not getting the most value out of it. So what do? I reached out to DBT Slack community, start asking questions. Michelle and I started talking regularly and swapping ideas and offering each other support, and eventually evolved into this talk.
Yeah, and so that brings us to what we're talking about today. So, DBT is incredibly powerful. We all know this, but it's also extremely flexible. And so what that means is if you're not careful, you can end up with a DBT project that is messy very quickly. Even the most well-intentioned teams fall into this trap. They find themselves in situations where they're prioritizing speed over quality code and ultimately find themselves with an unmanageable buildup of technical debt. And this experience is so ubiquitous that even the entry for the term technical debt in Urban Dictionary uses an example where a boss is requesting that 4 data pipelines are developed ASAP, even if it means that we're incurring technical debt and bypassing the expected process. Something else that's worth mentioning is that DBT is around 6 years old at this point, so we've only just now started to develop well-informed, opinions on the do's and don'ts of scaling a project, as well as you could be brand new to DBT and you just might not know any better. So this situation that you find yourself in is entirely possible. And so what Kelly and I have both kind of learned over the years, maybe the hard way, is that in order to get the most value out of DBT, you really need to have that upfront sufficient planning, develop that formalized maintenance framework so that you ensure that you don't end up with a mess that's kind of overshadowing the benefits of DBT.
All right, so I think we can all agree that tech debt is bad, but it's inevitable that every team is going to end up with at least some amount of tech debt. But how do you know when it gets to the point that you have an unmanageable amount of tech debt? So let's actually walk through some of the signs that your team might be dealing with an unmanageable amount of tech debt in your DBT project. Now, if any of these resonate with you, I'd love to hear about it in the Slack channel. If none of them resonate with you, please come talk to me after this. I want to give you a gold sticker and probably hire you. So just put that out there. All right, so if development on your team is slow, if someone goes to make a small change and it's taking forever, that's a really bad sign. If data team members are scared to make changes, I've seen this when you have the big monolith model with like hundreds of lines of code and no one wants to touch it because they're not really sure what's going to happen and they've been burned in the past, right? That's a sign that there's a lot of tech debt there. If you're slow to onboard new team members, right? If someone comes in and it's really difficult to learn and navigate the project and they have to be handheld by some more seasoned member of the team. If you start racking up unreasonable infrastructure cost, that's also a bad sign that you might have a lot of tech debt. When I hear people say, oh, a Redshift or Snowflake cost suddenly started increasing a whole bunch, one of the root causes might actually be tech debt in your dbt project. If your data team is in a state of reactivity and not proactivity, and you feel like your team is constantly firefighting in your dbt project and not producing new features, another sign of tech debt. And finally, if there's a lack of trust in your data, especially amongst your data consumers, your stakeholders, because there's a lot of bugs or inconsistent metrics and definitions, that's another sign that you have a lot of tech debt.
So that leads us into what we want to talk about today. We want to talk about our learnings, our approach to rehabilitating a dbt project that has kind of gone off course, is starting to feel the consequences of this unmanageable amount of tech debt. I do want to be clear, we're not going to talk about dbt best practices. Like, there's obviously plenty of resources online, great, best practice guides from dbt labs, but also the data community itself. What we really want to focus on, and you could argue this is the more challenging piece, is the change management of actually getting everyone bought in, getting the support to maybe temporarily slow down, even though, temporarily slow down the output for the data team in order to improve and accelerate your work in the future. And so that's what we want to focus on today.
All right, so if it's not a mystery that tech debt is bad, and there's all these best practices out there that you can reference in workshops, why doesn't every team just go overhaul their dbt project really quickly and fix it? Well, it's not quite that easy, right? So overhauling your dbt project is like swapping out the engines of a plane when you're flying 30,000 feet in the air. Teams often have hundreds of downstream dependencies, like dashboards. There's critical data workflows coming from your dbt models, things like machine learning models or reverse ETL. You also have a ton of stakeholders that you need to keep aligned with, right? You got to update them on every change that you make. And you also have to get stakeholder buy-in. This is one of the most important ones and hardest to do, because in order to tackle this tech debt, there's going to be a short-term loss of output and outcomes and delivering value for the organization while you go address this. And so you can overcome these challenges, I promise, but it is tricky. But the way that you're going to do this is you're going to get alignment within your own team. You're going to develop a plan, and you're going to execute and maintain. And so we're going to dive into each one of these in the context of dbt. All right. So the first step here is actually not agreeing on where there is a problem, but getting the data team to agree that there is a problem with tech debt. So I was working at an organization a few years ago, and we were early adopters of dbt. And so we really didn't understand what best practices were. And so it wasn't long before we started accumulating quite a bit of tech debt. Our development started to slow way down. We had a lot of bugs. We were constantly firefighting. And so we went from like loving dbt and thinking it was this game changer to all of a sudden feeling like, gosh, it's like really slowing us down. And what's interesting is that when I asked around and said, gosh, what do you guys think is the problem? I got a lot of responses about, we just need more people. But more people not following best practices just leads to more tech debt. More people doesn't decrease the development time for a single task. More people doesn't decrease the runtime for your project. More people doesn't decrease your cloud infrastructure cost. Importantly, more people is really expensive and doesn't scale well. And what's crazy is I hear this all the time. People always just want to throw people at problems, right? Okay, so how can you get your team to verify that technical debt is actually the problem and get alignment around that?
Yeah, so simply telling the team there's a problem or prescribing the solution, that will work to an extent, but it's not going to get us our best possible outcome. We really want everyone to feel aligned, bought into this mission, right? Because then that's going to result in the best possible output. And so one way to do that is to get everyone talking, encourage them to reflect on what has their experience been like working with data, and can they actually identify any maybe pain points or friction points that they've been experiencing, and kind of share that with the team, talk it out. So, that really starts with just simply asking questions. What, if anything, has gotten in the way of your progress recently? One of our favorite questions is like, if you could go back in time and start over, what would you have done differently? And so, following that, another exercise that we really rely on is the practice of hosting retrospectives. So getting everyone in the room, this intentional time for us to reflect, think back on our experience, and talk about ways that we can improve. Something that kind of came to light during the retrospectives on our team at Future was that the team was experiencing frustration with developing. They felt slowed down by the fact that our projects took a long time to run. So they would make a change, try to test it, it would take a long time, and then it was kind of like they couldn't iterate as quickly as they wanted to. I just think about the fact that if we hadn't set that intentional time for us to talk about what's working and what's not working, how long they would have suffered through that before we actually prioritized addressing it.
So if some people on your team are still a little bit hesitant, or they're maybe just not sure if the investment is really worth it, I find that getting a quick win can be a great motivator. So at Wealthy, our quick win was just restructuring the file directory in our DBT project and reorganizing some of the YAML files. So for those of you that use DBT, you'll know that this is a relatively safe and quick change to make, because it doesn't actually affect how DBT runs. And so this was great because it made development, like you could navigate the project so much easier. You could really see like the clear staging and production layers. And so it really improved the development workflow and gave everyone like a sense of satisfaction. And it got people wondering like, gosh, this is a quick change, and it made a big difference. Like what else could we do? Right? And so getting a quick win can also help your team start to figure out how they're going to come up with a plan.
Here are some other ideas.
Yeah, here's some other ideas for getting a quick win. Break apart a monolith model. So again, if you have one of those models with hundreds of lines of code in it, break it apart. You don't have to do any logic changes, don't have to do any code cleanup. Just break it apart into some simpler things so that it's easier to manage. You can also replace a piece of code with something like a macro. So that way, next time you go make an update, you don't have to update it in 5 different places, right? That's a quick win that can definitely deliver some value.
All right, so at this point, we have alignment. Everyone on the team is kind of bought into this mission. We see the light at the end of the tunnel. We think it would be worth making this effort to refactor our project. And so at this point, we can get started planning. And so that starts with really figuring out what work needs to be done, or rather, what work could we do? So obviously, starting with auditing the project itself, finding the areas of opportunity to increase efficiencies, and also making note of all the dependencies that exist, because that's going to be important as you start to plan. You're also going to want to go back and review the notes from those retrospectives that you held. Of course, the frustrations and the negative themes that popped up, but maybe the positives as well. What's working really well in one area that you can maybe try to replicate that feeling somewhere else in the data workflow or the project itself. Of course, the main reason that we have this DBT project in the first place is to deliver business value, so it's always important to make sure you're resetting what are those overarching company goals, short and long term. And then, of course, you're also going to want to talk to stakeholders. It doesn't necessarily make sense to talk about it in the sense of framing the problem as like, okay, we want to talk to you about data. What data needs do you have? What solutions do you need, right? Really focus on the problems and the challenges. What are the things that you're experiencing day to day that you're really struggling with? And then we can go back and really think about how could we use data to solve those problems.
All right. So as part of your planning process, you're also going to need to choose a strategy here, okay, on how you're actually going to execute the work. So there's really 2 main strategies that you can take when you're overhauling your DBT project. The first one is to edit your existing models and update the dependencies as you go. The second strategy here is to kind of build new versions along the side, and any new reports or analyses or things you need to build off that, point to the new versions. Now, at Wealthy, we had a lot of very critical dashboards and reports that would require major updates once we made the changes in DBT. We also didn't have a ton of workflows breaking or inaccuracies in some of these reports. So for us, it actually made sense to just build new versions on the side. That allowed us to kind of overhaul the project a lot faster and create this new, like, kind of best practices, ideal environment. The downside of that is you sort of have this lingering tech debt that's really annoying carrying it forward. So but there's not really one right way or one correct strategy, I guess I should say, because it really depends on your team, the number of dependencies, number of stakeholders you have. But thinking through it, if you don't have tons of dependencies or the dependencies are trivial to update, editing the existing models is often like the easier approach here, and just updating the dependencies as you go. If some of those dependencies or some of the models that are relied on dependencies are always requiring frequent updates, you're probably just going to want to go ahead and edit those existing models, so all your time's not eaten up by fixing old tech debt. If none of those things are true, or you're in an organization where you have a lot of like self-serve users using these reports, you probably just want to build new versions on the side, right? Because trying to update those stakeholders and all the changes constantly is going to be more difficult. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that one of the really tricky parts about overhauling your DBT project is getting that stakeholder buy-in, right? Again, this is super important. And Michelle and I find that creating some type of proposal document like you see here is a great approach. You clearly articulate the current pain points that your team has, and you want to also show like what that future ideal state could look like. All right, but when you do this, you want to be really sure to phrase your language in a way that relates to stakeholders. You want to make sure you articulate how it's going to make their lives easier, right? When you do this, one example here is if you want to optimize your queries to run faster, you don't want to say that, right? You don't want to throw a bunch of technical jargon in there that you don't want to understand, okay? Or that they don't understand. You want to make sure you articulate it and clearly tell them what matters to them, right? So instead of saying optimize queries to run faster, right? You could say, we need to refactor some of our code because it's going to allow the data team to iterate faster, produce more features faster for them, and even lower warehouse costs, right? Because that's the things that they care about.
Right. So at this point, we have that kind of buy-in from leadership, from our stakeholders, to work on this like general project. We haven't really gotten too much into the details yet. But at this point, maybe it makes sense to look back on that list of tasks that we thought were worth considering and prioritize. And so one framework that we both rely on pretty heavily is the impact versus effort matrix approach to prioritization. So that starts with, for every task, estimating how much effort is going to be required, how many resources to get a task done. And so you can use something like t-shirt sizes or story points to kind of assign an effort score. And so, it's important to consider that effort will increase with the increase in dependencies. If a task has more dependencies than another, it might mean more of an effort put forth. Also, long-term maintenance. So it's one thing to implement something, it's another thing to maintain it, like an entirely other thing. So definitely to keep that in mind. And then, of course, there are always going to be unknowns. So a certain task, you might not actually know how you're going to approach it. And in that case, you're just going to want to bake in some time in the form of like more effort for spikes or investigations before we're tackling that work. And then moving on to the impact. So impact will increase with alignment to company goals, and then also the potential to simplify or accelerate work in the future. And so, this whole process, it should really be collaborative and transparent. Collaborative in the sense that you want the whole team involved, the whole data team involved in figuring out, what are the scores for each of these, because some people on the team might have a better understanding of one domain or one data model than others. And then also transparent with stakeholders. So what we typically recommend is the data team take a first pass at prioritizing. Don't just show up to the stakeholders with a blank slate and say, okay, tell us what's important. Kind of show them the thought that went into, okay, here's how we're prioritizing. What do you think? They get kind of an opportunity to provide feedback, and then you might have a few back and forth like rounds of feedback in that sense. But at least they feel like part of the process and involved, and then it'll be more like the case that they're going to support this project. Okay, so once you have all the tasks prioritized, it's important to not just like go away into a room and then reemerge when everything's done. You want to be showing consistent output and keeping the stakeholders like in the loop on what's happening. So it's important to create transparency and also set expectations on, okay, we said what we were going to do, but when can you expect to see deliverables? And so that's where a roadmap might come in. And so a few important things to consider about the roadmap. The first is that you want to set your team up for success. So you definitely want to make sure to align the effort that you're committing to with the team's capacity. Don't oversubscribe the team to an unrealistic amount of work that they're not going to be able to do. Also, back to what Kelly was saying earlier about tailoring the communications for the stakeholders. In that roadmap doc, this would be really useful for stakeholders to be able to check in on. So rather than just saying refactor users model, you're going to want to also include what does that mean for the stakeholders? What are we now going to enable in terms of insights and speed? And then, of course, it's also important to be really careful about what deadlines you're committing to and upholding. So obviously all of this stuff is unknown. New things might come in that you're unexpecting and you might not actually hit the exact deadlines in this document. So kind of communicating the ambiguity or the uncertainty of certain timelines. Like we're saying this task is a small, but actually it has dependencies on the back end team. So there's a chance that we won't actually get it done in the amount of time that we're allotting here. And so that's where something like a VUCA score might come in and might be super handy. And then the last thing is that this should be like a living, breathing document. It should be consistently updated. The stakeholders should have access to it. And it's also going to iterate over time. You're going to learn, oh, we spent time investigating this one thing we thought was worth the effort, but we're actually going to pivot to something else that makes more sense now. And we actually have, we're going to have a link to a template version of this in the back of our slides.
All right, so you have your roadmap. You've aligned all your stakeholders. It's time to actually start executing and doing the work. As you start digging in, you're going to come to crossroads where you have to make decisions. And this is going to happen all the time. So an example of this could be, how do we name a model? Or how do we name a column? How do we structure our files? When and where do we use macros, et cetera, right? There's a whole bunch of places where you're going to have to make decisions. This is an opportunity to align and define a standard for your team. If you don't define a standard for your team, what happens is multiple standards end up in the project, and you end up in two totally different places, right? And so you're going to end up right back where you started with a ton more tech debt, okay? So let's go through an example quick. All right, this is kind of a simple example dealing with documentation in YAML files, but there's kind of two different approaches. Some teams love to document everything in doc blocks. Other teams love documenting directly in the YAML files, okay? There's pros and cons of each approach. I'm not going to go through them today, but if you don't define a standard here, you're probably going to end up with kind of a mix match and using both methods, right? So then inevitably documentation needs to get updated. Someone goes and updates it in the doc block, thinking all the YAML files are referencing that single doc block, but they're not, right? So now you have inconsistent documentation across your metrics, which is going to cause a problem. So this begs the question, how do we actually get alignment and define this standard? All right, well, this is our approach that we like to use at Wealthy. So if it's a decision we're not really sure about, or it's something we haven't encountered before, we start by just researching what others are doing, right? There's a lot of best practice guides out of there, a lot of great blog articles. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel, right? So we start there. Then we'll start collaborating, usually asynchronously, on listing out the pros and cons of each option. Then we'll discuss any misunderstandings or sticking points that we might have. And finally, we commit to a standard and we document it. Notice I use the word commit and not consensus. It's very rare that everyone on the team is going to completely agree, and reach consensus. And if you do, it usually takes a really long time to reach consensus, right? What's important here is consistency, okay? So commit to a standard and then document it. Right? So in something like SQL style guide, dbt best practices guide, whatever your team might use, make sure to document it. And then speak up when a standard is falling short, right? At Wealthy, we came up with a naming convention that we thought was great. We dug in, we started building models, and we started using it in our BI tool, and we realized, ooh, that was probably not the way we wanted to go. We wanted to do it the other way. So we pivoted, went back, changed it, updated the documentation, fixed it. We went on our merry way, right, to remain consistent. So don't be afraid to speak up. Again, that goes back to having those retrospectives and calling out those pain points.
Yeah. Great. So yeah, I mean, this whole thing is an iterative process. It's not linear. It's very much cyclical. You're going to be executing, and then hopefully along the way you're gathering feedback from the team, from the stakeholders, and then based on that feedback, you're kind of iterating. And really, everything we've talked about up to this point, you're going to iterate on and kind of go back and forth, jump between steps. And so just a few things to consider. The first is you want to make sure that you're facilitating a culture of learning. Maybe you did all this research to figure out how we're going to revamp our project today, but how do you make sure that you stay up to date with best practices? So whether that's setting aside full days for the team members to kind of think through, new techniques. Something that we do on our team is we kind of do this like synchronized reading time. Since we're a remote team, we'll all kind of read the same document or go through the same course materials and talk on Slack about what we're finding out and how this could maybe be applicable to our project and how we can continue to iterate it. And the other thing about this is really invest in process. So the way that we got here in the first place is because we didn't have that process, right? So you are going to come across points where you are faced with the decision again of do we incur technical debt or do we do this slowly and thoughtfully? And so if you do decide to go quickly because there's a good, valid use case, what are you going to do next? Are you going to make sure to document it and put it as a fast follow in your next sprint so that it doesn't get kicked down the road? And then, of course, hopefully you can avoid finding those situations altogether by just doing really thorough planning and being very clear about what's going on in the business, what's important for us to be working on, so that hopefully you're not surprised by last-minute requests.
All right, so let's summarize. If you find yourself in a place where you kind of have a hot mess in parts of your DBT project, you're not alone, right? We've been there, we get it. I think a lot of us can relate to that, right? And some tech debt is inevitable, but when you end up with that unmanageable amount of tech debt, you need to address it. It's super important, but we know it's tricky, right? Because there's a lot of downstream dependencies, a lot of stakeholders that you have to get involved, and you need to get that stakeholder buy-in, okay? So please take the lessons that Michelle and I have learned over doing this project. Since we've overhauled our DBT projects, we've seen an increase of velocity on our teams. We've seen a drastic drop in bugs getting pushed out and firefighting happening. We've seen our analysts spending more time actually delivering insights and not focused on DBT work. So we've seen some really great results. So good luck revamping all your DBT projects. We got a lot of resources to share in the Slack channel, and we're happy to continue the conversation there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.